Good afternoon. Welcome to Hyderabad Literary Festival. Economic growth, governance capacity, and poverty reduction remain the central questions for policymakers and citizens alike. Today's panel, Growth, Governance, and the Poverty Puzzle, brings together leading economists and policy thinkers to examine how evidence, institutions, and fiscal choices shape development outcomes. It's our privilege to introduce Abhijit Banerjee, Indian American economist and Ford Foundation International Professor of Economics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He is the co-founder and co-director of Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Lab, and in 2019 shared the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences with Esther Duflo and Michael Kramer for their experimental approach to alleviating global poverty. Also with us is Karthik Muralidharan, Tata Chancellor's Professor of Economics at the University of California, San Diego. His research spans public finance and development economics, and his recent book, Accelerating India's Development, a State-Led Roadmap for Effective Governance, reflects his work on state capacity, governance, and service delivery. He is the co-founder and scientific director of the Center for Effective Governance of Indian States. Moderating this session is Rathin Roy, macro-physical political economist and currently professor at the Kautilya School of Public Policy and a visiting senior fellow at ODI, London. He previously served as managing director of ODI, CEO of the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy, and as the member of Economic Advisor Council to the Prime Minister of India. His career includes senior roles with UNDP across New York, Kathmandu, Brasilia, and Bangkok, as well as advisory roles to the 13th Finance Commission and multiple Indian state government. Over to you, Rathin.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. Andaruku dhanyavadalu, namaskaram. So we have a panel here of which hopefully will be interesting because these are economists who have chosen at a time in their career when they didn't need to. They've become professors in prestigious universities and all that, to actually come in and speak comprehensively in the policy space. And if you read the books, you will find not just to politicians, but also to people like us, which is helpful because then you get a dialogue that goes on with, not just policy experts and bureaucrats and the state, but also people like us. And when I say people like us, I don't mean the subject of Abhijit's book. There's no subject of Abhijit's book present in this audience, not by a long shot. So by people like us, I mean people who are reasonably educated, the top 2% of the population of India, who feel they have things to say to the state. And that is our best hope. Outside the main political process, policy dialogue happens largely for better or worse in a country like India amongst people like us. So it's an important book for people like us. And yeah, it's even louder. My God, I've never heard that in my life. This is fantastic. When I taught at the D school, I used to teach 300 students without a mic many years ago. But what I propose to do is this. I'm going to ask both the professors to speak for 5 minutes on what they would like you to take away as a summary snapshot from the book. Yeah? Then I'm going to ask for a show of hands, and I'm going to ask for a show of hands and use by discretion as to how many people want to intervene after they have spoken. And based on that, I will ask a few or slightly more questions, inquiries, or points of discussion to both the authors so we can maximize the time we have. Right. Thank you, and over to you, Abhijit.
Rathin had very kindly warned me of his program, so I already had made up my mind that I will break the rules. I had the chance. I was not taken by a surprise. So I'll tell you, what I want to do is not so much tell you what is in the book, but why we wrote the book. Because I think that's actually maybe more interesting, and certainly much easier to summarize in 5 minutes. So 15 years ago, we wrote a book called Poor Economics. It was, we had no idea of how to even write a popular book, but it turned out to be a popular book. It's been by far the book that we've written that sold the most by order of magnitude. It's the only book that has earned a serious amount of money, for one, and just to be crude about it. So it's a book that we wrote at that time based on, I think, what was relatively new research, done by people like Karthik, on randomized controlled trials, but also on the general idea of learning about the lives and motivations of the average person in an economy like India, who's very poor, as Rathin was implying. And what drives them, what makes them make certain choices, what constrains them. And I think that at that point it was kind of half guesswork, because there was very little research, and we were extrapolating from a few points, joining them and trying to see if, when you join these points, does a picture emerge? 14 years down the road, it seemed worthwhile to go back to those and see, what did we get right? What did we get wrong? What did we not understand? Maybe we got it right, the answer right, but maybe we didn't understand the reasons why we got it right. So it's an attempt. So the expanded edition of the book is 100 pages added to the book, which are basically 100 pages which say, this is where we mostly got it, completely wrong. This is where we got it actually, fortunately, right. This is where we got it half right. This is what are the new insights. And this is what we didn't talk about, but should have talked about. Lots of big elephants in the room which we hadn't talked about then are now worth talking about, or because we know more about them. So all of that was the kind of the motivation of the book. And if you read this edition of the book, it's partly to, I think, to kind of reflect on the process of learning in the social sciences. That in some sense, you make hypotheses at the point where you are, you make hypotheses. The hypotheses are the best guess you have. The best guess is never perfect and sometimes wrong, but that's fine. That's the nature of the beast. You learn partly from having made that guess, then what you see next is actually becomes more transparent because it's not what I thought. And that's as interesting and sometimes more interesting than that's what I had predicted. So I think I feel like we live in a world where there are too many oracles, too many people are always right. We were not always right. We didn't try to be always right. And the motivation of the book is to say, this is sort of the nature of the beast, in a sense. We learn by looking at pieces of the elephant, and eventually maybe it comes together.
Thanks, Abhijit, and thanks to HLF. This is, I guess, my second session here on the stage. So I think my story is sort of, I'm intellectually a generation below Abhijit, where an intellectual generation is about 10 years, right? So, we were the first cohort of Abhijit, Michael, and Esther's students, and I did a whole bunch of RCTs of my own. But I think where my journey kind of built on that was that the motivation for the research in my case was almost always policy, and so almost every question I worked on was, my rule of thumb is I only work on issues that we spend at least 10,000 crores a year on, because if you then improve the effectiveness of that by even 1%, that's like 100 crore kind of, benefit. So I think building on a career of doing individual RCTs and writing research, around 2012, I started, working with the Planning Commission, writing background papers for the 5-year plan, became an honorary advisor to Niti Aayog, would go to the IAS Academy and train several IAS officers. And then also joined a couple of state chief ministers' advisory councils. And, I did all the things that one would normally do in an academic policy career, right? Where you're primarily an academic and then doing the work needed to summarize those insights for the policymakers at the time when policy documents were being written, okay? But I think my frustration in learning in this journey was the recognition that, really, even with access at the highest levels of government, what you were doing was only writing policy notes and at best allocating budgets, but not really moving the needle on outcomes, the extent to which you would want in terms of national development, right? And then, so I think the common intellectual thread that got connected across my 15 years of work in education, in health, in child development, and welfare was that most of our development conversations focus at a sectoral level, but the binding constraints are really horizontal constraints of governance in terms of how the public systems themselves are working inside. And so I think I had this unique perspective of an insider-outsider who was kind of constantly an academic and reflecting on what I saw, but trying to be kind of a scientist and engineer, where the scientist is trying to understand the world and the engineer is trying to use that understanding to build a better world, to come back and say that, listen, the elephant in the room in India, we keep saying policy is good, implementation is bad. So the question is why, and that means you've got to get into the beast of this thing called the state, right? And get into the innards of understanding how public systems work. And so I think, so the book that way is distinct from other books by academics that are often summarizing their research papers. This is a distinctly new intellectual argument, but that's built on a foundation of high quality individual studies. And the core of the argument is very simple, is that the return on investment of investing in better governance and state capacity is often 10 to 20 times higher than simply spending more money in a business as usual way, okay? And so, and this is where the body of evidence and where we kind of, really build off each other is that, even 20 years ago, if you were in a discussion in education, almost all the discussion would see increase the budget, right? And so what you got was not a right to, the Right to Education Act was really Right to Education Facilities Act, right? And so but then the research then helps you understand why is it not translating into outcomes. And so once you see that the core binding constraint is governance and state capacity, then that's kind of one message. But it's not enough to just say that, right? So the reason it's a big book is it's two halves, right? Because there's a first half that's building an effective state that's kind of looking at the state as an organization. A different way of saying this is most economists say, what should the government do? But we don't ask, how will it do it? Or can it even do it? Okay? So there's no shortage of policy prescriptions. There's no shortage of ye bhi karna chahiye, ye bhi karna chahiye, ye bhi karna chahiye. But kaise karoge yaar? And once you go and look at your real constraints of budget and HR, then you need kind of clarity both on priorities as well as this message of what is the binding constraint. And so I'll just wrap up with the analogy that I use, which is, just like the 1950s ambassador car was the metaphor of the pre-liberalization Indian economy, and then liberalization allowed us to kind of move faster, in many ways the Indian state is like a 1950s ambassador car, okay? Because the last time we systematically built the institutional foundations of the Indian state was in that post-independence period, right? So since then, we have kept on adding more and more and more expectations of the state without investing in the systems themselves, okay? So it's like the politicians are like the race car drivers trying to see in which direction to take the car, okay? But the car is barely moving, okay? So, and the bureaucrats are like the engines, the body and the wheels of this car trying to keep it moving. They would also prefer to be in a Toyota or a Ferrari, but they are stuck keeping the ambassador moving, okay? So just keeping it moving is a full-time job, so you don't have time to redesign and re-architect the state, right? So, and that's kind of what the book is fundamentally about, is like, how do you build a more effective state and use that to accelerate development? So then the second half of the book then gets into sectoral, kind of core sectoral chapters, where the other reason for writing this book is we have learned so much, right, over the past 20 years in so many areas that's not been synthesized in a way that's accessible to citizens, students, policymakers, just anybody. And so a goal of the book was to kind of just write in a very, very simple way and bring all that to the public with very grounded ideas for how you might actually move the needle forward. So that's what we're trying to do.
Beautiful. Thank you. I've read the book, so I can say that that's a very fair summary, almost a modest one. So, how many people will have questions already? Let's see. Okay, that's medium low. Good. So I'll start with my own. So, Abhijit, this is a fairly simple question, except possibly not. Yeah. your book is on poor economics, and we are sitting in Hyderabad. The extreme poverty ratio here is 3%. It's almost zero in Kerala and 1% in Tamil Nadu. What you're talking about in the book, is that only pertinent to the extreme poor, or is it also relevant to societies, economies that are not perhaps as extreme poor anymore, but still have a lot of the features that mark the badnesses of poverty, such as vulnerability, such as lack of income, such as poor education, health, etc.
I think you answered mostly the question yourself. I suspect you didn't think it was only to do with extreme poverty, and there was no presumption or implication that it would be. So I suspect you gave fairly eloquent answer to that. Let me add a little bit to that, though. So I think the point of the book was not so much this is what is the problem in the lives of extremely poor people. So that was certainly a theme. It was more that when we think about the problem in the lives of most people, including, of course, most people in India who are, I think, by any global standards, still very poor. The question is, what are things that they can control? What are things that are essentially either informationally or institutionally out of their control? And to what extent do they, therefore, the compromises they choose, to what extent do those move them in the wrong direction, possibly even? So the theme of the book was very much that it's not that people are stupid, is that they're trying to solve sometimes a very difficult problem, and that in the process they end up sometimes in a place where they may not have, they weren't trying to go there, but they went there because we created an environment within which that seemed like the logical thing to do. And that's a theme that I think, once you think about that idea, that's an idea that applies to most of our lives.
Fantastic. I think at least the three of us would agree that I've always said this all my life. I've worked with several governments. However absurd something seems from the outside, the governments are never illogical. They may be incompetent, they may be instrumentally wrong, but there is always an underlying logic, with one exception, this ambassador state of ours going to Davos in large numbers every year and meeting the same people they would meet in Chikatpalli, I've not understood. But leaving that logic aside, I'm sure there's logic to it. I just don't know it. I'm trying to say, it's not amusing. There is something going on there, believe me. So Karthik, on that note, if you take the Indian state, you have spoken about the public finances at length. And you have also spoken about local government. What do you see that is so ambassador-like about our public finances? And how do you want to make this into at least a Maruti Suzuki Desire, if not something nicer? I've stopped buying cars since Maruti Suzuki Desire.
Thanks, Rathin. So I think, so coming back to this, the innards, right, of the state. So one of the, I'll just take a 1-minute detour and come back to the question. See, I think one of the intellectually fun things about the book was that the individual studies are based on RCTs, but the organizing framework of the book actually comes more from organizational economics and not actually from development economics per se, right? Which is, if you think about the determinants of effective organizations, right, it's kind of what are your data systems, your HR systems, your public finance. And so Rathin's question is, how do you, and the simple point is that if you look at how budgets are made inside government, okay, so there's this old saying that never attribute to malice what can just be attributed to routine incompetence, okay? And so the thing is, bureaucracies are deep creatures of inertia, okay? And that is, I think, so the most important thing to understand in the bureaucracy is that, the reward for doing great things is very limited. The cost of making a mistake is very, very high, okay? So that extreme kind of risk-reward asymmetry means that the default in the bureaucracy is just to continue doing things the way they were. So even today, in most states, the budgeting process is essentially just take last year's budget and add 8% or 10%, and that's basically it, right? And so there is almost, so one of the arguments I'm making, see, the JPAL evidence-based policy idea was partly based on saying, we have micro evidence of things that can be incredibly effective that governments are not doing. So let's go and advocate and try to make that happen. So what I'm arguing for is take that to the next level, that as part of your budgeting process itself, if you can have certain basic discipline of saying, let's analyze every major piece of expenditure on a 2x2 of equity and efficiency, and saying, here is kind of the spatial incidence, the economic incidence of where the money is going, and you will find that, so the simple point, right? The left and the right argue about should we spend on kind of more social programs or on more capex and development, okay? And my point, a core goal in the book is to say, leaving the ideological fights aside, we spend hundreds of thousands of crores every year on things that are bad for equity and efficiency. And as a result, we don't have the money to spend on things that would improve both equity and efficiency, okay? So if you look at, say, just agriculture, right? I mean, the free electricity for farmers is probably one of the single worst policies we have in the country, okay? And that's because if you look at the equity impact, the top 5% of landowners get about 50% of that subsidy, okay? It's a disaster for our groundwater table. About 80 to 90% of water usage in India is for agriculture, right? So it kind of impedes crop diversification. You're growing paddy because you flood the fields, and, you know, and then people don't appreciate how much this hurts industrialization, because industrial power tariff is double what it needs to be because of the cross subsidy with free agricultural power. And then not to mention, when you look at the pollution in the north, a lot of this is kind of coming from stubble burning in places that shouldn't be growing paddy in the first place, okay? So the point is now, of course, like Rathin will say, there is a very good politics for why the bad policy is sustained, which is that, like Pranab Bardhan in '84 famously identified, that there are three major classes of vested interests that have captured the lion's share of public resources, which is big businesses, large landowners, and government employees. And so part of the goal here is by shedding the light on where the money goes to kind of have a more enlightened public conversation that bad policies are not hidden under things like farmer welfare. That the key lesson from the research is the design details matter enormously, okay? So I think there is a micro point that the studies show us both about free low-hanging fruit, and there's the macro institutional point about how do you build structures and budgeting processes to start reflecting that evidence on an ongoing basis. And those are the kind of institutional investments I'm talking about to make in the finance department.
That was quite interesting, and I completely agree with everything you said. Just to give the audience an example, in my state, Maharashtra, I've calculated that we have spent in 2024 prices 5 lakh crores on irrigation. And anyone want to guess what is the net increase in net sown area irrigated? It is 0. In 40 years, it is 0. Now, that can't be explained by Pranab Bardhan's oligarchy, but there is certainly something else going on there, which I think is important.
And if I may just there, see, I think there's the other trope I want to kind of break, is there's somehow this idea that, oh, capital expenditure is good and welfare expenditure is bad, okay? And that is complete nonsense, okay? If you look at CAG reports, the CapEx projects have like hundreds of thousands of crores of inefficiencies, okay? So whether it's time overruns, cost overruns, project selection, where is the project, why do you have so many potholes? And it just reflects the basic thing that even at budgeting, so looking at the low-hanging fruit, right? So some of the work my teams have been doing, some of the highest ROI comes from just these budget processes, right? You budget for the construction, there is zero budget for operation and maintenance. You budget, like, you know, you pay a lot of attention till you award the tender, but there's very little post-award contract management.
With good reason, politically.
I agree. But then again, the point is you shed the light, right? So you keep shedding the light, keep shedding the light, keep shedding the light, and then something will move, right? I mean, so that's how it works.
Since we are on the delightful subject of public finance, which my wife on payment death has told me never to bring a public economist home. I brought one once 35 years ago, and she said, I've never met a more boring person. They're forbidden for dinner. But since we're on the subject, Abhijit, I have a public finance small bone to pick with you, perhaps a clarificatory bone, I'm not sure. You quote in your book an RCT in Pakistan about tax collectors, which Adnan did and a few others, right? And in that you say that when you sort of paid off tax collectors, as I understand it, to collect more taxes, they collected more taxes. One, I don't find that extraordinary. It was done in the zamindari system, and it's been done everywhere. And two, there is absolutely no guarantee that the taxes that were collected were in any way legitimate. So how would I interpret that as a legitimate policy result, that if, paying people better improves tax effort? Or does paying people better improve tax exploitation? How should I read what you've written there?
I think, I didn't do the study, so I've...
But it's in your book. Huh?
But
In your book.
yeah. But I think they obviously have thought about this issue of whether it generates coercion or less corruption, and they can, because they can predict where the taxes should come from, they come from the right places. So it's a fairly straightforward exercise, but it doesn't look at all like it's coercion. Now, it could be, but it's not that they were unaware of this. I would say a bulk of the paper is on that point.
Okay, interesting.
And if I may, just, I think one criticism that RCTs get, right, is saying, hey, you're often just showing the obvious, okay? So I have the study of saying putting an extra worker in the Anganwadis where you find this big improvement. There's studies in Indonesia showing, how higher, increasing the just taxing staff, right, increases staff. The point is, it may be obvious, right? But nobody's still doing it. For 20 years, we're understaffed. So then the value of the study is not just showing that it had an effect, but quantifying that ROI and making the case that this is 20 times the ROI, and therefore shining attention on the things that need to be done.
I have no quarrel with that at all. I agree with Karthik. It's important to state the obvious. The trouble is if you misstate the obvious. But you haven't done that, in fairness. So just carrying on, Abhijit, with the book, I had a question to ask, which is... Well, I don't know, I have two questions, so I'll ask the first one. So there are two discourses on poverty that I'm familiar with. One from the UN, because I was fighting with the man every morning. He's a good friend, a remarkably ethical man, Jeffrey Sachs. And he has a certain take on poverty. And you have the sort of Paul Collier take on poverty, both of which you talk about at some length in your book. Even closer, okay, I'm practically kissing it. Could you tell the audience actually what these two hot takes were and why in the book you don't contest them, but you sort of evaluate them and say that, they're not, and your conclusion is, I understand that big picture stories like that can only take you so far. So if you could elaborate a bit on that part of your book.
So if I understand the question right, there's a set of, in fact, I think both of these stories are much about states. They are really stories not about individuals, but about how states function. And I think at some level, the Jeffrey Sachs view is that states that have too little resources cannot do all the right things they need to do, and therefore they don't do it. And the Paul Collier view is that the states if they had more resources, they would waste them, and therefore there's no point in giving it to them. I feel like I go back to Karthik. I think this is a great transition back to Karthik, who's trying to make the point that the state, I think, at least in the shape of trying to do the right thing, does the wrong thing. So I'm sure there are many cases, even in India, let me say it at risk of my freedom, that there is malfeasance of some kind. But nonetheless, I think the first order fact that Karthik is emphasizing is the opposite, which is that there's a lot of money that's spent in good faith that's spent badly. And I think that's I think a very useful point, because it's very easy, as our friend Elon Musk has said, that all third world governments just take money and steal them, and therefore there's no point in giving them aid. I think this discourse deserves a challenge, and one of the challenges that's useful is Karthik's one, which is that there is a lot of things done in good faith which don't work at all or are counterproductive, like the subsidy for farmers' electricity and so on. So I do think that there is a useful third position relative to those two, and that's where Karthik is.
Perfect. Thank you. In fact, one thing I've always felt disgruntled about when I went to study in England was that when you did sort of work on poor countries like India, you were basically not supposed to work on the UK. And I found it very odd living in England that I couldn't work on the UK, so I did. And I've worked in the UK all my life. And what Karthik is saying, I mean, I have, including in India and Brazil, the countries I've worked in, I've worked quite a bit on the UK economy. What Karthik is saying is also applicable, let me assure you, to most developed countries I know. If you just read the litany of the Channel Tunnel or the mess that is Thames water, you will understand that very often the patterns that we find here are replicated there. So this is not about Elon Musk saying, white man good, other people bad at all. Karthik, to turn to this, unpack this state a bit. You speak...
It is about, Elon Musk might be wrong, I dare say, but it is about exactly that. You're saying he is wrong, which I think is reasonable.
Yes.
But I do think that it is exactly on that point.
That he's wrong on that point, yes. Yes, absolutely. So, Karthik, you choose in your book and in your public work, which I'm familiar with now, to focus on state governments. You say nice things about local governments in chapter 8, but you leave it there. Why?
I think, so chapter 8, which is, on federalism and decentralization. So there's two parts of the question. First, why do I focus on the state? It's because constitutionally, all of the service delivery issues that I'm focusing on, are basically state government issues. And too much of our policy discourse focuses on what government India should do, right? So government of India can design schemes and create budgets, but the cutting edge of delivery is essentially at the state, okay? So that is the reason for starting at the state. Now, Rathin's asking a deeper question, right? Which is the state the right level, right? And the answer is no, okay? The answer is the correct level of local service delivery should actually be the local government. So one of the most important pictures in chapter 8 is one that shows how India is the most over-centralized country in the world in terms of the fraction of total public finances that are spent at the local government level. But before we start saying, okay, dekho, we are over-centralized, the real problem is not center to state, it is state to local. So Dr. Raja Chellaiah famously said, every politician wants decentralization up to their level, okay? So, so CMs will cry that the PMs are over-centralizing, but then they will not then let go authority down to the local governments, okay? So the reason I don't focus on local is because there is no local for all practical purposes. But that being said, I think, I'm clearly nudging in that direction, saying that that's where we need to go. And now, the one caveat I will add, and I may have even said this yesterday, right? See, I think it's important to understand why we are so over-centralized, okay? It's not because our founding framers were power hungry and saying, let's keep all the power, okay? It's because every country's constitution reflects a certain original moment, okay? And in India, we're over-centralized for three very important reasons. We are over-centralized politically because at independence, the biggest concern was the country was going to fall apart. Here we are in the 76th Republic Day, right? And we just gone through a partition. We were trying to integrate 500 plus princely states where 40% of the landmass was never under unified rule, right? So there's a reason why politically the constitution is so centralized. Economically, we are centralized because of state-led planning being kind of the policy du jour. But the most important reason we're over-centralized is actually social, okay? And this is something that not enough people appreciate. And the reason we're in most societies, service delivery is done by local government, okay? The problem is the progressive constitution makers like Dr. Ambedkar never trusted that local elites will allow marginalized populations to get educated or that local landlords would allow land reform to happen. And so the reason you have this over-centralized state is the idea of Nehru and Ambedkar was that you needed a modernizing bureaucracy to override a patriarchal, feudal, casteist, and and hierarchical society, right? So that's why the design is that way. Now, but what I argue today is that 75 years after, given education is much higher, information is much higher, that it is time to decentralize a lot more, especially at urban, for urban bodies. But that again is a conversation that has to come bottom up because no politician climbs the greasy pole of power to go to the top and then give up the power, right? Like scholars of power say, power is never given, it has to be taken, okay? So there's a scholar of democracy and decentralization, Jean-Paul Figuet, who I cite at LSE, and he says the struggle for decentralization is often as big as the struggle for democracy itself. That it requires people coming up there and saying that we need to manage our cities, look at the Chinese cities in China. And so there's an element that's about a people struggle. There's an element that's just about governance and saying, get our leaders. What I want every Indian politician to do is go to China and understand that we learn all the wrong lessons from China. That China doesn't succeed because it has a strong centralized state. It succeeds because it is the most decentralized large economy in the world, and let them come back with those lessons, and that's how we will move in the direction you want.
Excellent, thank you. In fact, on China, I've often wondered, what you're saying about India should have been true about China and other countries which went through terrible rifts like Vietnam, but oddly enough, they chose a path of decentralization, but it's for later. We can reflect on this. It's very curious.
The 30-second answer, right, is that you could argue that they went through their cultural revolution and that social upheaval, and therefore this sort of, they basically decapitated their elites, like, you know, and that allowed us, they literally did. So it's a very complex question.
Good. Maybe we should decapitate anyway. Right. So I'm going to now take questions. I'm going to stand up because it is otherwise impossible. I see you all, but I don't see them. Is anyone there? I want to give you one crack. Yes, the gentleman here in the check, in the t-shirt there. Is somebody giving him the mic? Right there behind. Ikarundi. Okay. Anyone here? Yes, the lady here. Yes.
My question to Karthik is...
And you. 3 questions, one by one, and then we can...
Karthik,
okay.
My question to you is data-driven governance. Data-driven governance. What are the challenges and the ways to improve that? Yeah.
Collect about 3 questions. 3 questions, yeah. Your question.
This is for Dr. Banerjee. I'm one of the people who contributed to your royalties for poor economics, so thank you for that. I really liked hearing you say about the mistakes that have been made and the elephants in the room that were not addressed. It would be lovely to hear maybe 2 examples.
Okay, yes, sir. No, behind you. Wait. Hang on, you need the mic.
Yeah, good afternoon, sirs. The government's vision of Viksit Bharat 2047. Fine. As a citizen, in this direction, I am concerned whether social, economic, environmental parameters, there will be progress in the right direction. To be more specific, the per capita income, because that's a reflection of the economic equalities, inequalities. So is the direction of the government okay? If not, what are the bottlenecks impeding this realization? And thank you, Mr. Karthik. This question was put to Dr. K.L. Krishna, Padma Shri awardee. He did say decentralization was one answer. Thank you. I was just remembering when you answered.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay,
thank you.
Over to you guys. First round, coming back.
On data-driven governance, the good news, the problem is this, right? I'll just give you one example, right? So in the private sector, there is enormous incentives to constantly improve productivity, right? So a company like Amazon, one company, Amazon, has over 1,000 PhDs, I'm not kidding, 1,000 PhDs, over 150 to 200 economics PhDs, about 800 engineers, operation science, data scientists. And what are they doing? They're running micro A/B tests to improve the productivity of every part of their delivery system, So given that's the amount that private companies do, and that's because there's a market incentive, to improve that productivity. The problem in government is that the incentives in government are about the appearance of activity, not the consequence of that activity, right? And so, which means that you will, that's why my chapters are very, very sympathetic to the government, So it's very, very easy for kind of tax-paying upper middle class, 2% over here to say, oh, politicians are all corrupt and power hungry, bureaucrats are all lazy and status hungry. See, the problem is that these are good people, but you have to identify the incentives and constraints within which they are working, So in IT systems, there is no shortage of government procurement projects that will get data, but by the time the procurement is done, the officer who made that order has gone, So then the next guy has no idea what was this designed for. So then you will have a bunch of white elephant projects. So in general, the best governance, Indian government in mission mode, when it puts people with a focus and gives them time, does amazing things, So the Andhra NREGS portal is one of the best in India and the world because you had the same principal secretary for 5 years who was able to conceptualize every aspect of the project. So the same Wipro, the same Infosys, in some cases working for government will do a great job. In other cases, the project will be horrendous. And one driver is, of course, the project manager. But the biggest driver is the quality of the client, So has the client applied his or her mind to what I want this for? So long story short, one of the things we do at CGIS and why we spend so much time on this data-driven governance is because it can be transformative, but you need a team that is holding the thread, regardless of who's transferred, who's coming, and continuously making the case to do this because it's not that difficult, but you have to do this in a systematic way inside the government.
So I think I think you asked actually several questions. So I'll answer a small part of it, which is what's something we got wrong. And I think it's interesting because it's sort of what we totally didn't imagine getting wrong. So we had different degrees of confidence. This one we were totally confident about. So one thing that you know people often observe is that if you look at the share of so people spending on nutrition, it's relatively low. And when you looked at people who were richer, they were not spending much more on nutrition. And so the economists' parlance on that was that nutrition is inelastic to income. So as a result, we then said in the book that therefore we probably need to change people's preferences. We can't change nutrition by just handing cheap grains to people, because cheap grains are just a form of income in a sense, and that's not going to do much. Well, turns out that then there was a set of randomized controlled trials, many of them, each had the feature of giving these relatively poor people some more income. And what you found was strikingly that if they were spending 40% of their income as a poor person on food, they were spending 60% of their income as a less poor person on food. So that seemed completely, every economist would say that food is a necessity, so people should first spend their money on food and then on everything else. Turns out that's backwards. People spend it on many things, and then when they get more money, they spend it on food. So it just turns out to be, we had a theory of how people should behave. And that's the whole point of the book, that we as economists, when we make policies, we have theories of how people behave, and those theories are often based on, nothing more than our self-reflection, and maybe we became economists because we believed that. I think we got it wrong, sort of, kind of in a quite striking way.
Well, actually, something tied to what he said, which I know from my time in government, which is that there was a strong body of economists, not me, in government, who said to the Prime Minister that if you spend, if you subsidize people's food, they will spend on other things and the economy will grow and we'll solve a demand problem. They were obviously wrong. You're so right. Okay, we have time for one more round of questions. The gentleman here first. Here. You have a mic? I'm sorry.
I think we didn't answer the gentleman's question about, your broad question is, are we on the right track, okay? And I think the problem there, so here is, I'm going to answer the question indirectly, okay? And I think the simple point is that, and I'll say this yesterday, I'll say this again, right? Which is, India is so big, okay? We have 1.4 billion people. We have more people than the entire Western Hemisphere put together, right? The Northern, Central, and Southern Hemisphere. We have more people, about the same population as all of Africa, okay? We don't expect the government of Africa to solve all of African problems. We don't expect the government of the Western Hemisphere to solve everything, right? So part of the point I'm making by focusing on states is that states are bigger than most countries, okay? So we really need to be asking a lot more of state and local government and not constantly looking to what is Government of India doing, because that is, Government of India can set enabling frameworks and provide money, but the cutting edge is always down. So let me kind of go back to decentralization and repeat what I said yesterday. The quote I like the best among the quotes is the one from Ashwin Mahesh, where he says, the best way to solve India's many problems is to increase the number of problem solvers, okay? And not wait for some great leader to come and solve it. It really requires active engagement at every level, and that's how we will kind of move more in the right direction than not.
Gentleman here and then the lady.
Sir, this question is to Karthik, and because you are working with the Andhra and Telangana governments, when 50 years back, when I was doing my MA, the public health system in Andhra and Telangana was good. The universities were good. My great Andhra University is having only 40 permanent faculty today. That was a great university. And are you taking any steps, or whether governments are willing to, because in Andhra, the chief minister says public-private partnership for health. In fact, public hospitals were doing great work 30, 40 years ago. And are they doing, whether Telangana government or Andhra government or Chhattisgarh or Odisha government, are they doing any such good work of public hospitals, good public universities, etc.?
Yeah, am I audible? Yeah, my question to you is, Karthik, here, on the podium. Yeah, here. Hi. So I've been following your work, like your interviews with Amit with COVID, healthcare, education system, and decentralization, like you spoke. So I've seen your talks. My question is, we are now at a conclusion or arriving at a conclusion that India is growing in a K shape, like the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer. Do you think when you compare with China parallelly, if you think if we would have focused more on manufacturing, a lot of unskilled labor like that we have in agriculture would have great exit options, and because India is such a domestically large market that we could use that manufacturing, and now even though it's been a while, we are transitioning from agriculture to services by skipping manufacturing entirely. Do you think that has cost us or bit us back? What can we do about it? Because India has a very large domestic market apart from having exports. So what is your take on that? Thank you.
Yeah. Hi, Karthik. Just a quick question for you. So as you're a big proponent of decentralization right now, given the fact that we are proposing more decentralization, what would be some key checks and balances or process level positions that you would take, given the fact that, Kaushik Basu in his book mentions that for every 1 rupee of benefit realized, the Indian government actually ends up spending 3.5 rupees. So going to the efficiency of spending and allocation and outcomes, but also a system of checks and balances there.
Anybody with a question for Abhijit? I think she had her hand up a long time. Yeah. Can you get the mic?
I don't need a question.
Yes. Given what you said about, can you hear me now? Okay, given what you said about how people spend on food, what is your view on rational choice theory as it applies to India, given our level of education, number one? Number two, how do the broad metrics that the government put out actually correlate to poverty, real experienced and lived poverty in India? And finally, we are a democracy. I suspect we are a bit of an illiberal democracy, and the way in which we are liberal sometimes is accidentally liberal because we are not a fully effective state. And if we were to be a very effective state while being illiberal, do you sometimes fear that we might actually become more illiberal?
So I'll take these first. So let me take the last, again, all great questions. And yesterday I was rushing off to a government meeting. Today I'll be available, at the bookstore, we can chat more. So see, I'll start with the last one, right? So like I said, the reason we were centralized was precisely because of the concern of local elite capture, which is why, if you read chapter 8, I'm never blindly advocating for decentralization. What I'm advocating for is a more nuanced decentralization. So let's take a simple example of teacher hiring, okay? Where the problem is we say we need bureaucratic exam-based hiring and we'll hire competent folks. The problem is those folks are completely unconnected to the community they're expected to go to, okay? So today, no chief minister I met is able to handle the problem of teacher attendance and teacher connection to the community, right? So we know the right way to handle that is the community. So the way I would balance this is by saying, but the problem if you decentralize, you'll say the Sarpanch will appoint his nephew, okay? So the way you balance this is by saying you have an exam-based empanelment, okay? Saying you need to meet these qualifications, but that doesn't guarantee you the job. The job is still controlled at the panchayat level, so you still have to be appointed. So you need that kind of nuanced balance of check and balance, and that's why you need to first understand the problem and then articulate the solution, okay? The question the gentleman asked, I think among kind of a generation who has kind of experienced good, stronger public services. I think what we forget is that public schools and public universities were good because they were only catering to the elite, okay? So the number, and a middle class, the number of people they were catering to was a lot fewer, right? So part of the quality challenge has become that as you've expanded scale, what has happened is two problems. One, the numbers have gotten much bigger. Second, elites have exited out of government systems to go to private. So this connects to our discussion with Sanjay Baru yesterday that, with the secession. So I think that's part of the problem. Now, is there a solution? Yes, but it's a long and complex issue, and that's why, like Sanjay was saying, yesterday, maybe one of the benefits of kind of the Trump shock is Indian elites will realize we have to stay back and build India, as opposed to exit. Okay, so I think it is going to take that level of engagement in our public spaces. And I think the last question on, so I think, and I'm going to cite Rathin here, right? See, sometimes I think we get into this delusion of being a middle-income country and worry about middle-income trap. Okay, and the thing is, we are actually 3 Indias, okay? So you are a GDP per capita of $2,800, but that's made up of an India 1 that's 10% at 15,000, and India 2 that's 25% at about $3,000, and an India 3 that is 1 billion people that is at $1,000 a month, and that is a demographic that's mainly participating in growth through the welfare programs, okay? And it's precisely because of those numbers that the politics of this country is all about who can announce the bigger welfare program, okay? Now, at some level, this is not a bad thing because 10% of India is still 140 million people. So you look around in Hyderabad, that is enough to drive all kinds of innovation. The GCCs, that engine is a strong engine, okay? So this is not a bad thing. The point is that where we need to invest is in empowering, that remaining 70%, to become active contributors to personal and national progress, and that will come only with human development, education, health, the things that we're focusing on. And ma'am, I think this last point about this is important to address, okay? Because I think one concern that people have who are skeptical of state power is, do you want to increase state capacity in a world where it could fall in the hands of a malevolent actor, okay? And I think my answer to that is absolutely you have to watch out. But in a way, that's a bit of a self-defeating argument, because if you believe in democracy, then the institutions that are supposed to be checks and balances themselves need capacity, okay? So today, one of our biggest human rights tragedies is that 70% of all incarceration in India is under trials who have not been found guilty, okay? So, but that means that is happening because you don't have the judicial capacity and the police capacity to process those cases in time. So you need state capacity even to secure your democratic freedoms, and that's why, that's where we have to.
Let me maybe focus on actually something you almost didn't ask, but stay close to that, because I want to actually take a slightly different take on this question of democracy and authoritarianism. And I think one of the things that we don't talk about is that in India we have 1.4 billion people and 540 seats in the Lok Sabha. In the UK, we have 60 million people and 650 seats in their Lok Sabha. So the per person number of people per MP is 30 times larger in India. There are 30 times more people per MP. So the MP is therefore unable to do very much for anybody. It's just too big a constituency. So now how do we think about that? We can't have a parliament of 15,000 people. Presumably, it's already dysfunctional and would be more dysfunctional. So let we, you could throw shoes and nobody would able to see it because there's so many people. So therefore, so we need to think about, and the thing that I think part of what Karthik is saying is that you need to devolve power to the states. But in fact, the states are too large. And we need to devolve, what we need really is parliamentary constituencies or people who have the corresponding power of a parliament MP we need 15,000 of them. So we need to transfer power down to the place where they can exercise it. So the power has to come down. So if we had, instead of this, we have 35 states. If we had 3,500 states, we would actually be, I think, being able, maybe some of them will have better state capacity than others, but we would have a space where there would be much more representation. Democracy would be much closer to people. And second, it would create so much less central authority, that the exercise of authority would be much more limited. You couldn't, the democratic takeover would be much more difficult if you are dealing with 3,500 different authorities all over. Controlling them would be that much harder. I think it's easier to control it when you have smaller number of units. I think we want more units in this country.
Well, that brings us to the end of what I think has been an excellent 51 minutes. We're exactly 1 minute over time. Thank you very much, both of you, for engaging with the audience, and thank you for being such a lovely audience. We had a good Q&A for a change, which is always a good thing in LitFest like this. Over to you, ma'am.
What happens when two Maharathis of economics are moderated by, another one? A packed house with only standing room. Thank you for a wonderful session and conversation.